Number 5. But still farther, the independence of the Church was invaded in the matter of the meetings of her assemblies. In the Act 1592, which was reviled and confirmed in 1690 as the Magna Carta of the Establishment, the King claims the power, when present in person or by his commissioners, of appointing the time and the place of the next meeting of the Assembly, and in the exercise of the authority thus vested in him, he summoned in the Act of Settlement the First Assembly of the Revolution Church. The power thus constitutionally vested in the Crown is quite incompatible with the headship of Christ and the independence of his Church, and it may be employed to prevent and defer the meetings of the Assembly for any length of time. Nay, it appears to us that if the civil power is at liberty thus to interfere with and control the meetings of the ecclesiastical courts, no good reason can be shown why it may not also review, interdict, and rescind the sentences of these courts. Take from us the liberty of assemblies, and take from us the gospel, said Knox to Secretary Maitland. That this provision of the Act of Settlement is not to be construed into a mere stately parade of idle form, which can involve no practical consequences of an improper kind, appears from the fact that the assemblies of the established Church have actually been again and again dissolved, prorogued, and interdicted by the sovereign, the Church yielding with the most undutiful and humiliating submission to these repeated acts of tyranny and wantonness. And here a footnote. In 1691, 1692, 1693, 1694, and 1695, Plain Reasons, page 22. Far otherwise did the Church of the Second Reformation act. She claimed and exercised in this matter the liberty bestowed on her by Christ her head. Her views on the subject are expressed in the Act of 1647, adopting the Westminster Confession of Faith, in which she puts forth a caveat against an Erastian construction of a certain portion of that standard. And in the year 1640, the state passed several acts in which provision was made for the independent jurisdiction and regular meetings of the General Assembly, and which must be regarded by all acquainted with them as very far in advance of the Great Charter of 1592. And here a footnote. Act annet the ratification of the acts of the Assembly, also Act Recissory, the Act of Parliament 1649 ratifying the Confession of Faith, also ratified the Act of Assembly adopting it, in which act the Assembly claimed the exercise of independent authority in reference to their meetings. Nor can we avoid an allusion here to the noble display which the Church of that period gave of her fidelity and freedom in the first assembly held in 1638, when the King's Commissioner, having in his master's name dissolved the assembly and discharged them from proceeding farther under the highest penalties, Alexander Henderson, their distinguished moderator, exhorted them, quote, to be zealous toward their Lord and to maintain the liberties and privileges of his kingdom, unquote, while, with remarkable devotedness, all remained firm, unshaken, and united, and proceeded in bold defiance of the frowns and menaces of the monarch, with the grave and important business for which they had assembled. Number 6. The next point which claims our attention in the settlement of the Revolution Church is the manner in which the question of church patronage was disposed of, and the enactment which was framed to regulate the calling and induction of ministers. In 1649, towards the close of the Second Reformation, lay patronage was entirely abolished by the state, and the Parliament evinced a very accurate acquaintance with the proper limits of its own authority, and due respect for the exclusive jurisdiction of the Church in spiritual matters, by leaving her free and unfettered to devise such a measure as she might consider fit for giving effect to the popular voice. The Assembly, accordingly, enacted the Directory of 1649, which, whatever may be its defects and imperfections, possessed this grand qualification, that it was an ecclesiastical law, passed by a spiritual court in reference to a purely spiritual matter, and was therefore completely free from the slightest taint of Erastianism. It is well known that with the restoration of Charles, patronage was restored, and the Parliament of 1649, by which it had been abolished, rescinded. In 1690, when the Act of 1592 was revived and confirmed, that part of it relating to lay patronages was expressly accepted and appointed to be afterwards taken into consideration. Accordingly, an act was soon passed in which Parliament did statute and declare that the heritors of the parish, being Protestants, and the elders, are to name and propose the person to the whole congregation to be either approven or disapproven by them, and if they disapprove, that the disapprovers give in their reasons to the effect the affair may be cognosed upon by the presbytery of the bounds. Where there was no landward parish, the patronage was vested in the magistrates and town council and kirk session of the burgh, and it was ordained that in lieu and recompense of the said right of presentation hereby taken away, the heritors and life renters of said parish and the town council for the burgh should pay to the said patronage pay to the said patrons, the sum of 600 merks. Now we object to this provision first because it prescribes both a civil and religious qualification for the exercise of a spiritual duty, the heritors and the town council being associated with the kirk session in, quote, naming and proposing the person to the whole congregation, unquote. Second, because the qualification of their being, quote, Protestants, unquote, required in the heritors is so very loose and indefinite that it admitted of Episcopalians and Independents, of persons of immoral conduct, and of men of almost every shade of sentiment and character. Thirdly, because it gave the congregation only a negative power, the power of offering objections, not of addressing a positive call to the object of their free and conscientious choice, thus depraving them of the privilege which unquestionably belongs to the members of the Church of Christ. Fourthly, because in order to avail themselves of this provision, a pecuniary compensation was to be made by the parish to the patron, which implied that it was not the spiritual and inalienable right of the people to elect their own ministers. Fifthly, because in devising and enacting this measure, instead of annulling the act recissory and acknowledging the competency of the arrangement both of church and state in 1649 in reference to this matter, the Parliament homologated that infamous deed, and the Church, by acquiescing in this scheme, instead of falling back on the Ecclesiastical Directory of 1649, which had never been repealed by any competent authority, virtually acknowledged the power of the state to suspend and rescind ecclesiastical laws. Sixth, because this enactment was passed without consulting with the Church upon the subject, the whole affair having been arranged and determined 3 months before the General Assembly was allowed to meet. Seventhly, because we utterly and most vehemently deny the competency of the state to frame any regulations for the Church on this subject, however extended the basis on which they rest. It is fatal, irremediably fatal, to this measure, that it was a civil directory imposed on the Church in relation to a spiritual privilege. The secular element is as clearly introduced here as in the law of patronage itself, and we behold the civil power intruding itself through this element into the sanctuary and reaching the symbol of its authority even to the altar of the living God. This law was not of long duration. In 1711 it was repealed, and patrons were restored to their ancient rights. But we confess ourselves altogether unable to see any great difference in point of principle between the act of William and Mary and the act of Queen Anne. If you grant that it is competent for the state to enact laws for regulating the spiritual affairs of Christ's house, you must also admit that it has the power of altering and annulling them, of rendering them more or less stringent, as it sees cause. The Act of 1690 professed indeed to abolish patronage, and the Act of 1711 to restore it. But the hateful stamp of Erastianism is equally borne by both. Both flow from the same source, and they encroach alike on the spiritual jurisdiction of the Church of Christ. In one respect, we are disposed to think the act of William and Mary was even more objectionable than that of Anne, inasmuch as in it the state openly, positively, and unceremoniously enacted all the regulations bearing on the election of the ministers of the sanctuary. And yet, what is to us perfectly surprising, this same state directory is held up by many of the opponents of patronage in the present day as a matchless model for the imitation of the statesmen of Queen Victoria, while a certain number of Parliament, and here a footnote, our Stewart Esquire, member for the Haddington District of Burghs, has recently informed the Church and the country that he intends to attempt legislating on the subject and to copy in his proposed bill as closely as he may the provisions of this statute. We trust, however, that we think we can discern certain encouragements to the belief that the progress of the controversy will lead to clearer and sounder views in reference to a measure equally objectionable in its principle and details, a measure in which the state still reserved to itself an Erastian control over the election of ministers of the gospel.